During college, I worked part-time at the campus library. The shifts were quiet and predictable, especially the late ones, which I actually enjoyed. The library was massive, with rows of bookshelves that seemed to go on forever, and dimly lit corners where few people ventured. I usually spent my time shelving books and helping the occasional student. Nothing ever felt out of the ordinary, until one night. It was almost closing time and the library was empty except for me and my coworker, Sarah. She was downstairs organizing a return cart while I handled the upper floor. As I was putting books back on the shelves, I noticed something strange. A book lying on the floor in the middle of the aisle. It was odd because I'd just walked through that section and hadn't seen it there before. Bottom. I picked it up and placed it back on the shelf, thinking nothing of it. A few minutes later, I heard a faint rustling sound. At first, I thought it was Sarah, but when I called out, she didn't answer. I shrugged it off and went back to work, but then the sound came again, this time louder. It sounded like pages being turned, quickly and forcefully. I followed the noise, weaving through the aisles, but every time I thought I was getting closer, it seemed to move further away. I froze, trying to convince myself that it was a trick of the light. But then I heard it again, the sound of pages turning. It was coming from a table in the far corner. When I approached, there was a single book lying open on the table. Its pages were blank, except for one word scrawled in red ink. Stay. I backed away, my heart racing, and ran downstairs to find Sarah. She was still by the cart, completely unaware of what had happened. I tried to tell her, but she laughed it off, saying it was probably just my imagination or someone playing a prank. Reluctantly, I finished my shift. When I locked up that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't go back to the library for my next shift. I called in sick. But Sarah did. The next day, I got a call from our manager asking if I'd seen Sarah. She never went home after her shift. I tried to explain what had happened that night, but it sounded ridiculous, even to me. A week later, I went back to the library, unable to ignore the guilt. It was the same as always, except for one thing. On the table in the back corner, there was a book lying open. Its pages were blank, except for one line, "You left her." I quit the job that night. I don't go near libraries anymore, but sometimes I dream about that book and wonder if Sarah is still there, somewhere in those endless aisles, waiting for someone to notice. A few months ago, I took a job at a small, privately owned library in my hometown. It wasn't anything grand or special, but the pay was decent, and I liked the quiet atmosphere. My shifts were typically in the evening, which was fine since the library rarely had visitors at night. One evening, while I was organizing a shelf in the history section, I noticed a faint scraping noise coming from somewhere deeper in the library. It sounded like something dragging across the floor. I assumed it was a loose chair or table, so I went to investigate. As I moved through the aisles, the sound stopped. I chalked it up to old building quirks and returned to my work. About an hour before closing, I noticed something strange. One of the return carts, which had been empty earlier, was now filled with books. It was odd, because I hadn't seen anyone enter the library since my shift started. Figuring I must have missed someone, I began shelving the books. That's when I realized they were all from the same section, the folklore section, in the far corner of the library. As I approached the section to put the books back, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air felt heavier, and the dim lighting in that corner seemed even darker. I quickly shelved the books and left, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. But just as I turned to walk away, I heard a distinct whisper behind me. It was so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but it was undeniably real. The next night, I hesitated to show up for my shift, but I convinced myself that it was just nerves. Everything seemed normal until I noticed the folklore section again. One of the books I'd shelved the night before was now lying open on the table nearby. I hadn't placed it there, and no one had entered the library yet. When I approached the book, I saw that several pages had been torn out, leaving jagged edges. In their place was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. "It's not just a story." I was thoroughly creeped out but didn't know what to do. I decided to leave the book on the table and move on. A few hours later, I heard the scraping noise again. This time it was louder and seemed to be coming from the folklore section. Against my better judgment, I went to check it out. The moment I stepped into the aisle, all the lights in the library flickered and went out. My phone's flashlight was my only source of light. I scanned the aisle, my heart pounding, and then I saw it. One of the books was floating mid-air. It hovered for a moment before dropping to the ground with a loud thud. I grabbed the book and bolted for the exit. As I fumbled with the lock, I felt a presence behind me, something cold and oppressive. I didn't dare turn around. I finally got the door open and ran out into the night. The next day, I returned with the library's owner to explain what had happened. When we went to the folklore section, the book I'd taken was back on the shelf, perfectly intact, with no missing pages. The owner dismissed my story as exhaustion, but I quit on the spot. I haven't stepped foot in a library since. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint scraping sound in my dreams, and I wonder if the stories in that folklore section were more than just tales. A couple of months ago, I had to pull an all-nighter for a research project. My usual coffee shop study spot was closed, so I went to the 24-hour library on the edge of town. It was old and quiet, almost eerily so, and I rarely saw more than a few people there, even during the day. That night, the place was practically empty except for the librarian at the front desk, who barely glanced up as I entered. I found a seat in the corner near the philosophy section and started working. The silence was comforting at first, but as the hours passed, it began to feel oppressive. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something odd. A book on a nearby table that had been closed when I sat down was now open. I hadn't seen anyone else in that area. Assuming I just hadn't been paying attention, I ignored it and kept working. About 30 minutes later, I heard faint footsteps. They seemed to circle my area, but never got close enough for me to see who it was. I leaned back to check, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence returned, heavier than before. By 3 a.m., I was packing up to leave when I heard what sounded like a low whisper behind me. It wasn't words, just an indistinct murmur. I spun around, but no one was there. I grabbed my bag and headed for the exit. As I passed the philosophy section, I noticed a single book lying in the middle of the aisle, its spine facing up. The title was The Observer. I didn't think much of it at the time, but something about the way it sat there felt off. I left without looking back. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Out of curiosity, I went back to the library during the day. The usual librarian wasn't there, replaced by someone I hadn't seen before. When I asked about the other librarian, the new one looked confused and said, "I'm the only librarian here. No one else works nights." Froze. I had seen her. The librarian from the previous night. She'd been sitting at the front desk when I came in. Trying to shake it off, I wandered back to the philosophy section. The book, The Observer, was gone. I asked the librarian about it, and she told me the library didn't have a book by that title. That night, I stayed home. I couldn't sleep, though. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unlisted sender with the subject line, "Did you see it?" The body of the email was empty except for an attached image. I opened it and my stomach dropped. It was a photo of me sitting in the library the night before, taken from the philosophy section. The worst part, in the background of the photo, I could see the librarian sitting at the front desk, staring directly at the camera.